Albert Speer sat across a wooden table in a converted schoolhouse in Flensburg, Germany, on the morning of May 23, 1945. The war had ended 15 days earlier. Outside, British sentries patrolled the perimeter of what had once been the seat of the brief Dönitz government. Inside, American interrogators from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey had arranged their notebooks, their statistical tables, and their questions with methodical precision. Speer had been Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production since February 1942. For 3 years and 3 months, he had controlled the industrial output of the Third Reich. He had overseen factories from the Ruhr to Upper Silesia, from occupied France to Bohemia. He had mobilized millions of workers, reorganized production systems, and reported directly to Adolf Hitler on the weapons output that would determine Germany's survival. He believed he had performed a miracle of industrial organization. The interrogators placed a document in front of him. It was a statistical summary, typed on American military stationery, listing monthly production figures for aircraft, tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition. The numbers on the left side of the page showed German production. The numbers on the right showed American production. Speer looked at the figures. He looked again. Then he asked if there had been a mistake in translation, if perhaps the American numbers represented annual production rather than monthly output. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The interrogator, a civilian economist named Paul Barron who had joined the Strategic Bombing Survey's team of analysts, told him the numbers were correct. They represented monthly averages for 1944. Speer sat quietly for a moment. Then he began to speak, and he would continue, speaking for 7 days, providing testimony that would fill hundreds of pages of typed transcripts. What emerged from those interrogations was not just a statistical accounting of German war production. It was a detailed confession of strategic miscalculation, a documentation of industrial inadequacy, and a recognition that Germany had fought a war it could never win. The realization did not come suddenly. It came gradually, answer by answer, number by number, as American interrogators walked Speer through the arithmetic of his defeat. They asked about steel production. Speer provided figures showing Germany produced approximately 2.7 million tons of steel per month in 1944. The Americans noted that United States steel production exceeded 7 million tons per month. They asked about aluminum, critical for aircraft production. Germany produced roughly 33,000 tons per month. The United States produced 150,000 tons per month. They asked about copper, about coal, about oil, about every raw material that fed the industrial machine of modern warfare. At every turn, American production exceeded German production by factors of 3, 4, sometimes 5 to 1. Speer had known Germany was outproduced. What he had not fully grasped until confronted with the complete statistical picture was the magnitude of that disadvantage and the impossibility of overcoming it through organizational efficiency or worker dedication. The story of how Albert Speer came to sit in that schoolhouse, confronting numbers that demolished his assumptions about German industrial capacity, begins not in 1945 but in 1942, when he inherited an armaments ministry in crisis and believed he could save Germany through better management. When Albert Speer became Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production on February 15, 1942, Germany was already losing the industrial war. The loss was not yet obvious. German armies still held vast territories across Europe and Western Russia. The Wehrmacht appeared powerful, equipped with tanks, aircraft, and artillery that had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, Greece, and much of the Soviet Union's European territory. But the appearance of strength masked a fundamental weakness in the industrial base supporting those armies. Germany's war economy in early 1942 was not a fully mobilized industrial system. It was a partial mobilization, constrained by Hitler's insistence on maintaining civilian consumer goods production to preserve morale on the home front. Factories operated on single shifts. Women were largely excluded from industrial work, unlike in Britain or the Soviet Union, where female labor had been mobilized extensively. The production of luxury goods continued. Bureaucratic competition between different agencies, the SS, the Wehrmacht, various party organizations, created inefficiencies and duplication of effort. Fritz Todt, Speer's predecessor, had recognized these problems, but lacked the authority or political skill to overcome them. When Todt died in a plane crash on February 8, 1942, Hitler appointed Speer to replace him. Speer was 36 years old, an architect by training, with no formal background in industrial management or economics. What he possessed was Hitler's confidence, administrative energy, and a talent for organizing complex systems. Speer immediately began restructuring the Armaments Ministry. He created a system of industrial committees organized by weapon type, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, naval vessels, where manufacturers cooperated under ministry oversight rather than competing for contracts. He standardized designs to reduce production complexity. The Wehrmacht had fielded dozens of different vehicle types, each requiring unique spare parts and maintenance procedures. Speer pushed for standardization, fewer models produced in larger quantities. He rationalized the allocation of raw materials, directing steel and aluminum to priority programs rather than distributing them through political favoritism. He expanded the use of forced labor, bringing millions of foreign workers and concentration camp prisoners into German factories. This was not a humanitarian decision. It was a calculation of industrial necessity. Germany's military losses on the Eastern Front had killed or disabled hundreds of thousands of skilled workers who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht. Those men could not be replaced from Germany's existing population without either conscripting women on a massive scale, which Hitler refused to authorize, or importing labor from occupied territories. The results of Speer's reforms appeared impressive. Tank production increased from approximately 400 vehicles per month in early 1942 to 900 per month by the end of that year. Aircraft production, which had stagnated at roughly 1,000 planes per month, climbed to over 2,000 per month by late 1943. Ammunition output increased significantly. Artillery piece production expanded. By every metric Speer tracked, German war production was growing. Speer reported these increases to Hitler in regular meetings, presenting charts and statistics that showed climbing production curves. Hitler was pleased. The Wehrmacht generals were pleased. German newspapers published stories about the armaments miracle, about the genius of industrial organization that was providing the weapons needed for final victory. Speer himself believed the statistics validated his methods. Germany was producing more weapons than ever before in its history. The industrial base, properly organized, was delivering the tools of war. What Speer did not know, because Germany had no reliable intelligence on Allied production, was that the increases he had achieved were utterly inadequate, measured against what the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were producing. German tank production of 900 vehicles per month in late 1942 looked impressive compared to Germany's previous output. It looked pathetic compared to Soviet production of approximately 2,000 tanks per month, or American production that would soon exceed 3,000 tanks per month. The belief system that sustained German military planning through 1942 and into 1943 rested on several assumptions about industrial warfare and national economic potential. German strategists believed that Germany's industrial efficiency, its advanced engineering, and its skilled workforce gave it a qualitative advantage that would compensate for quantitative disadvantages. They believed one German tank properly designed and manufactured with precision engineering, was worth 2 or 3 Soviet tanks built with cruder methods. They believed German aircraft, built to exacting standards, were superior to mass-produced American planes. This belief had some foundation in early war performance. German equipment in 1939 and 1940 was generally superior to that of its opponents. The Messerschmitt 109 fighter outperformed most Allied fighters it encountered in the war's first years. German tanks, particularly the Panzer III and IV models, were well-designed, reliable machines with good optics and fire control systems. German artillery was accurate and well-served by trained crews. The Wehrmacht's initial victories seemed to validate the assumption that quality could overcome quantity. German military doctrine emphasized operational excellence, the skilled use of combined arms tactics, rapid movement, and concentration of force at decisive points. These tactics had worked brilliantly in Poland and France. They had achieved remarkable successes in the Soviet Union during 1941, despite enormous Soviet numerical superiority. German officers believed, with considerable justification based on their experience, that superior training and doctrine could defeat larger but less capable forces. The economic assumptions underlying German strategy were more complex and more flawed. Hitler and many in the German leadership believed that Britain and the United States, as capitalist democracies, would lack the political will to sustain a long war of attrition. They assumed that democratic governments, dependent on public opinion, would seek negotiated settlements rather than endure the casualties and economic sacrifices necessary for total war. They believed the Soviet Union, which they viewed as a primitive society held together by terror, would collapse once its initial military forces were destroyed. These assumptions led to critical strategic decisions. Germany did not fully mobilize its economy for total war until 1943, 2 years after the invasion of the Soviet Union and 4 years after the war began. The decision to maintain consumer goods production, to limit women's factory work, to preserve elements of peacetime economic structure was based on Hitler's belief that maintaining home front morale was more important than maximizing weapons output. Germany, Hitler reasoned, had lost World War I because the home front collapsed, not because the army was defeated in the field. He was determined not to repeat that mistake. Speer's reforms in 1942 and 1943 operated within these constraints. He could rationalize production, eliminate inefficiencies, and increase output within the existing system. What he could not do, without Hitler's authorization, was transform Germany into a fully mobilized war economy comparable to Britain or the Soviet Union. And what neither Speer nor Hitler fully grasped was that the United States was building an industrial war machine on a scale that dwarfed anything Germany could achieve, even under total mobilization. The American industrial base in 1942 was producing weapons at rates Germany's intelligence services either did not believe or did not report accurately to German leadership. When German analysts received reports of American production figures, they assumed the numbers were propaganda, inflated for psychological effect. No nation, they believed, could actually produce 4,000 aircraft in a single month, or build a merchant ship in 40 days, or manufacture 100,000 trucks in 60 days. These numbers seemed impossible, more likely examples of American boasting than actual industrial achievement. Speer shared these assumptions. He knew American industrial potential was large, but he believed German efficiency and focus could compete effectively. His reforms were producing real increases in output. The numbers were climbing month by month. Germany was producing more weapons in 1943 than it had in 1941 or 1942. The trend was positive. The industrial system was working. Victory, while difficult, seemed achievable if Germany could hold its defensive positions while increasing weapons production to sustainable levels. This was the belief system. the foundational assumption that would shatter completely when Speer sat down across from American interrogators in May 1945 and learned the actual numbers. The interrogation began with what seemed like simple administrative questions. The American team, led by George Ball, a lawyer and economist who would later serve as Under-Secretary of State, asked Speer to describe the organizational structure of his ministry. They asked about reporting lines, about how decisions were made, about which agencies controlled which aspects of production. Speer answered readily. He had nothing to hide about organizational matters. The war was over. Cooperation with the victors seemed both prudent and inevitable. Questions shifted to production figures. The Americans asked about aircraft manufacturing. Speer explained that Germany had produced approximately 40,000 aircraft in 1944, the peak year of his ministry's output. This represented a significant increase from the 35,000 produced in 1943 and the 15,000 produced in 1942 before his reforms took effect. He described the system of ring production he had implemented, where final assembly plants drew on networks of component suppliers, allowing production to continue even when individual factories were bombed. The interrogators asked if Speer knew American aircraft production for 1944. He estimated perhaps 60,000 aircraft, acknowledging American industrial capacity was larger than Germany's, but suggesting the gap was manageable, perhaps 50% greater output. The actual figure, the Americans told him, was 96,300, 18 aircraft, not 60,000. Nearly 100,000, more than twice German production. Speer's initial response, recorded in the interrogation transcript, was to question whether this number included training aircraft, liaison planes, and other non-combat types. Perhaps the Americans were counting every airframe that came off a production line regardless of combat capability. The interrogators clarified. The figure of 96,000 included only combat aircraft, fighters, bombers, attack aircraft, and patrol planes. It did not include trainers or utility aircraft. If those were added, American production exceeded 120,000 aircraft for the year. The interrogation moved to tanks. Speer stated that Germany had produced approximately 19,000 armored fighting vehicles in 1944, including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. This was more than triple the production of 1942. The industrial committees he had organized were functioning efficiently. German factories were building Panther and Tiger tanks, technically superior vehicles that could defeat any Allied tank in direct combat. Quality, Speer suggested, compensated for any numerical disadvantage. American tank production in 1944, the interrogators informed him, was 29,573 medium and heavy tanks, not counting light tanks, tank destroyers, or armored cars. If those categories were included, American armored vehicle production exceeded 47,000 units. The ratio was not close. It was not competitive. It was overwhelming. The United States had outbuilt Germany in armored vehicles by more than 2-to-1 in combat tanks and by more than 4-to-1 in total armored vehicles. The pattern continued across every category of military production. Artillery pieces. Germany produced 41,000 tubes of all types in 1944. The United States produced over 80,000. Small arms. Germany manufactured approximately 2 million rifles, submachine guns, and machine guns in 1944. American small arms production exceeded 6 million weapons, trucks and transport vehicles. Germany produced roughly 90,000 trucks in 1944. American truck production was 500 to 34,000 vehicles, a 6-to-1 advantage. Speer asked about Soviet production, trying to understand the complete picture. Surely the Americans and Soviets together had outproduced Germany. but perhaps the combined Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy before its surrender, had maintained some sort of parity. The interrogators provided those figures as well. Soviet tank production in 1944 was approximately 29,000 vehicles, roughly equal to American output. Soviet aircraft production exceeded 40,000 planes. The Soviet Union alone had matched or exceeded German production in most categories. When American, British, and Soviet production were combined, the Axis powers had been outnumbered in weapons production by approximately 5-1. The interrogations continued day after day. Each session lasted several hours. The Americans were systematic, working through production categories methodically, asking Speer to explain German output and then presenting the Allied figures. They asked about steel production, the fundamental measure of industrial capacity. Speer provided the numbers he knew. Germany had access to approximately 2.7 million tons of crude steel per month in 1944, drawn from German mills in the Ruhr, Upper Silesia, and occupied territories. The United States produced 7.4 million tons of crude steel per month in 1944. Britain added another 1.2 million tons. The Soviet Union, despite losing significant industrial capacity to German occupation, still produced approximately 1.4 million tons monthly. The combined Allied steel production was 10 million tons per month against Germany's 2.7 million, nearly a 4-1 advantage in the most basic industrial metric. The Americans asked about aluminum, essential for aircraft production. Speer knew these figures precisely because aluminum had been a constant bottleneck in German aircraft manufacturing. Germany produced approximately 33,000 tons of primary aluminum per month from domestic refineries and Norwegian plants. The United States produced 156,000 tons monthly, nearly 5 times German output. Canadian aluminum production added another 60,000 tons to Allied supplies. Germany's aluminum shortage had forced designers to use more steel in aircraft construction, making planes heavier and less efficient. Copper production. Germany mined and refined roughly 3,000 tons of copper monthly, supplemented by recycling programs that collected copper from occupied territories. American copper production exceeded 70,000 tons per month. British Empire sources added more. The shortage of copper had forced German electrical manufacturers to use aluminum wire in many applications, a less efficient substitute that reduced performance. Oil production. This was perhaps the most critical shortfall. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, supplemented by Romanian oil fields until those were lost in August 1944, provided approximately 1.2 million tons of petroleum products monthly at peak production in early 1944. By late 1944, after sustained Allied bombing of synthetic fuel facilities, German oil production had collapsed to roughly 300,000 tons per month. American oil production exceeded 20 million tons monthly. The United States was the world's largest oil producer, with vast fields in Texas, California, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. American forces had essentially unlimited fuel supplies. German forces were immobilized by fuel shortages. Luftwaffe pilots received reduced training because aviation fuel was scarce. Tank units remained in defensive positions because moving them consumed precious fuel. Naval vessels stayed in port. The entire German war machine was starved for oil, while American vehicles, ships, and aircraft operated without fuel constraints. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The interrogators asked about labor. How many workers had Speer controlled in his ministry? He provided the figures. At peak mobilization in mid-1944, German war industries employed approximately 14 million workers, including forced laborers from occupied territories, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. This represented nearly total mobilization of available labor, constrained only by the need to maintain agricultural production and essential civilian services. American war industries employed approximately 17 million workers in 1944, but this represented only partial mobilization. The United States maintained substantial civilian production throughout the war. American factories produced automobiles, refrigerators, and consumer goods, even while manufacturing weapons. The American workforce could have been expanded further if necessary. Germany had reached its absolute limit. On the third day of interrogation, the Americans presented Speer with a detailed breakdown of bomber production. This was personal for Speer. Bombers had destroyed much of what he had built. Strategic bombing had disrupted transportation networks, destroyed synthetic fuel plants, and forced the dispersal of factories into smaller, less efficient units. The bombing campaign had been the dominant factor constraining German production in 1944. Germany had produced no strategic heavy bombers. In 1944, the Luftwaffe had abandoned heavy bomber development after the Battle of Britain, focusing instead on fighters and medium bombers. The He-177, Germany's only operational heavy bomber, had been cancelled in 1943. Britain produced 7,776 heavy bombers in 1944, primarily Lancasters and Halifaxes. The United States produced 16,196 heavy bombers, primarily B-17 and B-24 models, 24,000 heavy bombers. Germany had produced none. The disparity was absolute. The Allied combined bomber offensive had operated with numerical superiority so complete that losses could be sustained indefinitely. When a B-17 was shot down, American factories built 3 more. When bomber crews were killed, American training programs graduated replacement crews by the hundreds. The industrial base supporting the bombing campaign was effectively unlimited. Speer had known the bombing was heavy. He had seen the reconnaissance photographs of destroyed factories. He had read the reports of rail networks disrupted and synthetic fuel plants burning. What he had not fully grasped was that the bombers attacking Germany represented only a fraction of total Allied air power. Thousands more American aircraft were deployed in the Pacific Theatre. British Bomber Command was only part of the Royal Air Force's strength. The Soviet Air Force operated thousands of aircraft on the Eastern Front. The air forces bombing Germany were just one element of Allied air power, yet they alone outnumbered the entire Luftwaffe. The interrogators asked about fighter production, since Germany had prioritized fighters in 1944 to defend against the bombing campaign. Speer confirmed that Germany had produced approximately 25,000 fighters in 1944, the majority of all German aircraft production. This represented his P-Stuff greatest success, increasing fighter output from roughly 1,000 per month in early 1943 to over 3,000 per month by mid-1944. American fighter production in 1944 was 38,776 aircraft. Soviet fighter production exceeded 30,000. British fighter production was approximately 9,000. Combined Allied fighter production was 78,000 aircraft against Germany's 25,000, more than 3 to 1. Even in the category where Speer had focused Germany's resources most intensively, the Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority. The numbers accumulated, session after session, category after category. Merchant shipping. Germany had built approximately 200,000 tons of merchant shipping in 1944, mostly coastal vessels and small freighters. American merchant ship production was 8 million tons, 40 times greater. The Liberty, ships alone, those mass-produced cargo vessels built in less than 2 weeks each, exceeded Germany's entire merchant fleet. Explosives production, ammunition consumption, radio sets manufactured, optical instruments produced, medical supplies, uniforms, boots, food production, transportation capacity. Every metric revealed the same pattern. Germany had increased its production under Speer's management. Those increases were real, documented, significant compared to Germany's earlier output, and they were utterly inadequate compared to Allied production. The gap was not close. It was not competitive. It was overwhelming, existential, mathematically impossible to overcome through any amount of organizational efficiency or worker dedication. By the fifth day of interrogation, Speer had stopped questioning the numbers. The Americans had brought documentation, production reports compiled by their intelligence services, verified by multiple sources, cross-checked against German records that had been captured. The figures were accurate. Speer began instead to explain how Germany had attempted to compensate for the production gap. He described the dispersal of industry after 1943, moving factories into tunnels, caves, and reinforced bunkers to protect them from bombing. He explained the system of underground production facilities, like the Mittelwerk complex in the Harz Mountains, where V-2 rockets were manufactured by concentration camp labor. The dispersal had preserved some production capacity, but at tremendous cost in efficiency. Moving machinery underground was expensive and time-consuming. Underground facilities lacked natural light, proper ventilation, and efficient transportation access. Workers in these facilities suffered higher accident rates and lower productivity. What Speer had gained in protection from bombing, he had lost in production efficiency. The net result was that German production in the second half of 1944, despite nominal increases in some categories, was actually less than it would have been if factories had remained in their original locations, operating without bombing disruption. The interrogators asked whether Speer had ever presented these production comparisons to Hitler. Had the Führer known the true extent of the production gap? Speer's answer, recorded across several pages of transcript, revealed the internal dynamics of the Nazi leadership. He had presented production figures to Hitler regularly, always emphasizing German increases, always framing the reports positively. He had not presented comparative figures showing Allied production because he did not have reliable intelligence on Allied output until after the war ended. German intelligence services had provided estimates, but those estimates were consistently too low. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had reported American tank production at approximately 12,000 vehicles annually in 1943. The actual figure was 29,000. The Luftwaffe's intelligence branch estimated British bomber production at perhaps 3,000 aircraft per year. The actual number was more than double that. German intelligence either could not believe the reports it received or deliberately underestimated Allied capacity to avoid delivering bad news to leadership that did not want to hear it. Hitler had received reports about American industrial capacity, but he dismissed them as propaganda. The Führer had told Speer, on multiple occasions, that democratic societies lacked the discipline and organization for sustained industrial effort. American workers, Hitler believed, were soft, accustomed to high wages and consumer luxuries, incapable of the sacrifices required for total war. Roosevelt's promises of massive production were psychological warfare, intended to demoralize Germany, not actual descriptions of achievable output. Speer had believed Hitler's assessment, at least partially. American production seemed impossibly high in the reports that reached Berlin. Surely the numbers were inflated, rounded up, perhaps double-counted, to create an impression of strength. Even now, sitting across from American interrogators with documented evidence in front of him, part of Speer's mind struggled to accept the figures. How could a nation produce 96,000 combat aircraft in a single year? How could factories build a merchant ship in 40 days when German shipyards needed 6 months? How could steel mills produce 7 million tons monthly when German mills, among the most modern in Europe, produced 2.7 million tons? The answer, the interrogators explained, was industrial organization on a scale Germany had never attempted. American factories operated multiple shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days a week. Production lines were designed for maximum efficiency, with specialized workers performing repetitive tasks rather than skilled craftsmen, building complete units. Standardization was extreme, with identical components used across multiple weapon systems to simplify manufacturing and maintenance. The American economy had been organized for mass production since the 1920s, when automobile manufacturing had pioneered assembly line techniques. Those techniques had been applied to weapons production with devastating effectiveness. Raw materials were abundant. American mines produced vast quantities of iron ore, coal, copper, and other essential materials. Oil fields provided unlimited petroleum. Agricultural productivity fed both the civilian population and military forces, with surplus remaining for export to allies. The American economy in 1944 produced a gross national product of approximately $223 billion, measured in 1944 currency values. German gross national product was roughly $75 billion. The economic base supporting American war production was 3 times larger than Germany's, and the United States had mobilized that base more effectively. The interrogation transcripts, eventually running to more than 300 pages, documented not just production figures, but Speer's gradual acceptance of what those figures meant. Germany had never had a chance of winning a sustained industrial war against the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. The mathematical impossibility was clear. Even if German forces had fought with perfect tactical efficiency, even if every German weapon had been qualitatively superior, even if German workers had achieved impossible productivity levels, the numerical gap was too large. Speer made this explicit in testimony on the 6th day. The interrogators asked if Germany could have won the war with better economic organization. Speer's answer was unambiguous. No. Germany's industrial base was insufficient for the war Hitler had chosen to fight. Better organization, which, Speer believed he had provided, could increase efficiency and output. It could not overcome a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 disadvantage in fundamental industrial capacity. The only way Germany could have won was if the war had ended quickly, before Allied industrial power was fully mobilized, or if the Allied coalition had fractured through political divisions. Neither had occurred. The Soviet Union had not collapsed in 1941 as Hitler expected. Britain had not negotiated peace after France fell. The United States had entered the war with full commitment after Pearl Harbor. By 1942, when Speer took control of armaments production, the outcome was probably already determined by industrial mathematics, though the fighting would continue for 3 more years. The interrogators asked about specific weapons systems where German technology had been superior: the jet aircraft, the Me-2, 6-2, the V-2 rocket, advanced submarines with snorkel equipment, infrared, night vision devices. Germany had indeed developed advanced technologies, some of which were years ahead of Allied equivalents. Speer acknowledged this, but noted that technological sophistication could not compensate for numerical inferiority. Germany had produced approximately 1,400 Me-262 jet fighters. They were faster than any Allied fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour. But 1,400 jets could not contest airspace against 78,000 Allied fighters, even if each jet was individually superior. The V-2 rocket was a technological marvel, the world's first operational ballistic missile. Germany had fired approximately 3,000 V-2s at England and Belgium. Each rocket required enormous resources to produce, complex manufacturing processes, rare materials, and skilled labor. The explosive payload was 1 ton, less than a single heavy bomber could carry. The cost per ton of explosive delivered was hundreds of times higher than conventional bombing. The V2 program had consumed resources that could have produced thousands of fighters or hundreds of tanks. It had achieved negligible military effect. Advanced technology, Speer told his interrogators, had been Germany's consolation prize. When a nation cannot compete in quantity, it pursues quality. When mass production is impossible, craftsmanship becomes the alternative. Germany had built sophisticated weapons because it could not build enough simple weapons. The sophistication was impressive but militarily irrelevant against enemies who could overwhelm German forces through sheer numerical superiority. The interrogation concluded on May 30th, 1945, after 7 days of testimony. The Strategic Bombing Survey team had gathered the information they needed to assess the effectiveness of the bombing campaign and to understand German war production. Speer had cooperated fully, providing detailed answers, correcting American assumptions when German records showed different figures, explaining the constraints and challenges of managing industrial production under wartime conditions. The final session included a question about Speer's own understanding of Germany's situation during the war. When had he personally realized that Germany would lose? Speer's answer was complex. He had recognized by late 1944 that military victory was impossible. The loss of Romania's oil fields in August, the failure of the Ardennes offensive in December, the relentless bombing of synthetic fuel plants, all indicated that Germany's position was hopeless. But he had continued working, increasing production where possible, because stopping would have meant abandoning German soldiers at the front. The deeper realization, the understanding that Germany had never had realistic prospects of victory against the Allied coalition, came only during the interrogation itself. The complete production figures, laid out systematically, revealed that Germany had been fighting a war it could not win from the moment the United States entered the conflict. Perhaps earlier, if the Soviet Union's industrial capacity was properly understood. The war had continued for years after the outcome was determined, consuming millions of lives and destroying much of Europe, because German leadership had not understood or would not accept the industrial mathematics of modern warfare. Speer was not executed as a war criminal, though his use of forced labor and concentration camp prisoners would form part of the charges against him at Nuremberg. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, serving his full term at Spandau prison in Berlin. He was released in 1966, having become the regime's good Nazi in popular perception, the technocrat who claimed ignorance of the Holocaust and cooperation with Allied interrogators. His interrogation testimony, however, stood as something more than an individual confession. It was a documentation of strategic failure, a case study in the consequences of misunderstanding industrial capacity, and a demonstration that technological sophistication and military skill could not overcome fundamental economic disadvantages in modern warfare. The numbers Speer had been forced to confront in that schoolhouse in Flensburg were the arithmetic of Germany's defeat. Those numbers revealed truths that extended beyond World War II. Industrial capacity determines outcomes in sustained conflicts between modern nations. Economic production sets boundaries on military possibility. Leaders who misunderstand or ignore industrial mathematics risk catastrophic strategic failure. And no amount of tactical brilliance or technological innovation can compensate for being outnumbered 4-1 in the fundamental resources of industrial warfare. The soldiers who fought on both sides, the workers who built the weapons, the civilians who endured the bombing, experienced the war as individual struggles for survival. But the outcome was determined by aggregate production figures, by tons of steel and aluminum, by numbers of tanks and aircraft, by industrial capacity mobilized and organized for war. Speer had managed that industrial system for Germany as effectively as anyone could have. and it had not been nearly enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.